the novel is structured in a braided form. I came to think of it as a challah bread, which is a braided yeast bread, a traditional Jewish bread. But I initially began it not thinking that I wanted to write a book with a certain structure, but thinking I wanted to write about certain characters. And then as I realized that I had this three-stranded storyline, that's when I started to realize what the structure needed to be. I knew that I needed a creature or an imp of some sort of netherworld creature. And I was reading a little newspaper article by a Satmar Jewish woman who had 10 children in Canada, and she wrote this little article about how her adult daughter had been doing household chores all day and was followed around by a fly who was constantly with her when she was taking care of the baby, when she was washing the floor, and finally she said, oh, maybe it's a soul doing penance. And I, at that moment, thought, wait a minute, is there reincarnation in Judaism? And in fact, it was that moment that unlocked this door that really gave birth to gave me the novel. So that I really got the idea of a fly specifically from her, although the tradition of insects in Jewish literature is a rich one, and Isaac Bashevitz's Singer uses little spiders who speak to people, and obviously Kafka was the great insect innovator. So it's a tradition. Very often, earthly happiness is at the expense of personal freedom. I think that is often the case.
Okay.
Yes. And I think that that's the big question: what's more important, freedom or happiness? It's a big question.
And yeah, in Masha's case in particular, how does that play out for her? Because she obviously has a certain happiness within her family, but craves this freedom.
Well, I think, I don't know if you could call what she gets out of her work exactly happiness. It's a kind of it's a kind of stalking of oblivion, which is a feeling that she gets of self-forgetfulness when she's acting, which becomes a kind of addiction for her and a need. I think it's a complication in that she does feel stifled in her own home, but there's a man that she was going to marry that really is kind of a great guy, and that there was a kind of happiness that could have been there for her. So in a sense, she's going to be one of the fugitive kind, which is sort of what I have in the beginning of the novel, that quote by Tennessee Williams about the fugitive kind. I think of Masha and Jacob as of the fugitive kind, which in a way are, I suppose, artists. I really always thought of it as an eminently sane religion and sort of hermetically sealed in its rationality in some way. Even though it was faith-based, seemed like a law-based religion in a sense, very perfectly male in some sense. I don't know how else to describe it. And as I started to really research the folklore and the superstitions and the almost between the lines part of Judaism, the interpretations, the thousands of interpretations that are in Kabbalah and that are in the folk tales, I began to realize that in fact it's rife with both with storytelling, with a kind of wildly imaginative life, which is almost, I would say, almost feeding off the Torah, almost like little pilot fish on a whale or something, and it's just. In fact, shimmering with these other worlds, and that really fascinated me and made me was in a way pagan almost, and made me very, very intrigued by Judaism. And also, I started. This sounds sort of silly, but there was a show, a sitcom in the 1950s called, I think it's called The Goldbergs, and it was this big Jewish mother with an enormous bust, and she was sort of tragic, and she was always running around bossing everybody about. The rest of the family was sort of more assimilated, like the kids were sort of normal American kids pretty much, and the father was a sort of shadowy figure, but the mother was huge, but she was very kind of bossy, and she was funny, and she was emotional, and she was a pain in the neck, but very lovable. And as I was watching her recently, well, not so recently, but when I was researching the book, I started to have this sort of uncanny feeling like I saw myself in her. And I began to see the ways in which I was probably like, my grandmother, great-grandmother, and on into eternity, that my sort of Jewishness in part was, just a cultural, it was in my blood, that I was a Jewish mother. That was a bit of a shock. I think that at its core, many human activities, and I would actually include great athletes in this. I think there's a moment of total self-forgetfulness when one is really in the zone of making something, in the very center of where you're supposed to be when you're making something, in which you almost forget who you are. And I think that is probably common in all the arts as well. And I think that, of course, acting is interpretive in the sense that you're taking another text and interpreting it. But in a way, when you're writing, there's a lot of conscious note-taking and hunch following, etc. But once you kind of lock in and you have your premise, and you have to then prove your premise, which is your novel, you have a kind of premise. After a while, I think that the characters do take on a life of their own. So it's not exactly passive, but it's a conversation between passivity and consciousness. So you're always having a conversation, because if it's only unconscious, then you would have a formless mush. But if it's only conscious, then you probably aren't a writer.
Is the writer then more like the director than an actor to a certain degree, because once you've set an actor at work and you think they're starting to take on the role, you do kind of set back and...
Well, I honestly, personally feel that the most important quality of a director is transparency, which is something that not many people talk about regarding directing, where you actually forget that you exist. You stop being anyone. And that was, in fact, my great liberation when I started directing, because I realized that who I was physically and my physical self, ceased to matter at all. I had no sense of existing. I had only a sense of watching. And in fact, that sort of disappearance, it's very similar, again, to that idea of being a conduit of sorts. I think it's tied into the idea of negative capability, that sort of old idea that you so observe with such intensity that you almost become something else. And in each art, it's different, but I do think all art is essentially one, I would argue, with different, we have to separate them because we need to find expertise, we need to get good at them.
Yeah.